This lecture, we're going to be talking about measurement in crime. And so we're going to go exactly through the steps of how we measure variables and how we take constructs and concepts and make them into tangible things that we can put numbers to, that we can quantify and categorize. And so, as we talked about last lecture, this is sort of the process of developing knowledge. Like, we have interests, ideas, theories. This is a lot of what we talked about last lecture, is how theories and like concepts that have historically we've learned about or have been developed get sort of retested and examined and proven wrong or right through different types of methods, right? Like experiments and survey, research, qualitative analysis. And so right now we're going to be looking at this step here, is like, how do we get these ideas and theories into concrete things, concrete constructs and measurements that we can talk about, so that way when we're in a discussion with another person, they know what we're talking about, right? Because things can have very different meanings to different people, especially when we're thinking about more theoretical things like disorder. What is disorder? What does that look like? Or sort of social class. How do we measure that? Do we look at income? Do we look at education levels? Or do we look at occupational title, like whether or not you're a manager or not, and where you are in like a hierarchy? So this entire lecture is going to be talking about measurement and the conceptualization portion of things. And we're going to try and apply it to crime and how we measure crime and the different types of ways and means in which we go about measuring crime. Measurement can be imprecise, right? Because we're dealing with concepts sometimes that are hard to measure and that are more abstract. It might mean different things to different people from different backgrounds or perspectives. So we want to move from these like big ideas to something that is more tangible and that people can all agree on a specific measure, so that way they can communicate with each other. And so these are the measurement steps. You're first like conceptualizing this bigger thought that you want to have. So crime, where you first conceptualize we think about crime, like what we categorize as crime, and then we go through an iterative process of trying to define it with words conceptually. And then we develop an operational definition, and that's how we measure it with data specifically. And oftentimes, I'll get into this more, when we're thinking about crime, crime is already being measured in the real world by police, by governments, by institutions. So a lot of times, criminologists and researchers who are interested in crime are depending on those already measured sort of secondary data sources to understand crime. And we can sort of work with those to define specifically what we're looking at. So we're going to start with conceptualization. So a conception is a mental image of something we have. And then concepts are words or phrases and descriptors we use to represent those mental images. So for example, disorder. What do you guys think about when you think of disorder? I might think of garbage or litter or broken glass, right? Like, that's classic broken windows. So what we would do to take that sort of mental image of what you're thinking about when you think of disorder is to do exactly what I just did, to describe, to develop definitions that are reflective of what we might be imagining in our head, but we also need to take into account that our particular personal image of disorder might be different than others, right? Okay. So conceptualizing means specifying precisely what we're talking about in specific terms and like getting really down to the nitty-gritty of what we mean. So there might be indicators that we will rely on to sort of show the definition of what we're talking about. And there oftentimes we're speaking in binary terms. So there's either the presence or non-presence of something. There's the presence of litter, or there's the non-presence of it, and that is an indicator within itself. So there are 3 classes of measurement, and your book talks about this, but one are direct observables. So we can like visually see colors, shapes, whether or not something is present in an environment or not, like garbage. And then there are indirect observables, things that are more complex, for example, reports and court transcripts, the examples they have there, it's something that's defined by another actor. So it's not like we can look at someone and know what their criminal history is or what they said in court. We need some documentation of that. So those are more subtle and complex things that are defined by other institutions, right? And then there are more theoretical constructs, which are the things that were often, if you're going into academia, those are the larger things you're thinking about that are hard to define. Or if you're a practitioner and you're dealing with like therapy, like it's hard to define depression, right? That's a construct that we've developed to sort of define a mental health issue. But we observe or develop self-report data that people can sort of indicate indicators that they may be depressed, right? And there's sort of a composite score that we develop, and we'll talk more about composite scores. So the difficulty of being able to observe these things gets harder as you go down, right? So direct observables, we could see exactly with our eyes. Indirect observables, we'd need to sort of look at something else. The book talks about like historical analysis and content analysis. That might be where we look for indirect observables. And then constructs are things we have to like further define for ourselves because we can never really see them. Okay, so there's different levels of measurement. There's the nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. So these are often how we sort of the quantitative characteristics of how we're defining things. So nominal is labels, categories, how we categorize things, and there's not necessarily a specific quantity. We can't put it in a scale. They're just sort of all valid outputs that could occur, right? So often when we're thinking about state of residence, it could be any state within the US. So there's this sort of range of options that we have, but living in New Jersey versus living in Illinois, it's not, one isn't better or different, it's just different, right? And so then there's ordinal variables, which are ranked. So education, there is a clear delineation in like higher and higher levels of education. It's like a superlative. You could have the most education you could have gotten, or you could have just had the minimal amount of required education, which would be like a high school degree, right? Or finish only partially high school. And so ordinal variables and measurements have numbers that reflect some sort of meaning to them, and categories that are associated with numbers in a ranked order. And you see this often in like a Likert scale when there's a survey. If you've heard of a Likert scale, it's like, do you agree with this statement? 1 is completely disagree, and like 5 is completely agree. And saying your opinion in between those things shows the strength of whether or not you agree or disagree. And then there's intervals, and this means that the when you're in a Likert scale, which is ordinal, from really disagree to disagree, we don't really know what tips someone over to disagree. But in an interval scale, if we're thinking about sort of IQ or temperature or risk score, right? There is a definable spectrum, and 1 to 2 means the same thing as like 2 to 4, right? The differences between those two are quantifiable and they mean something, and they're consistent across meaning and across measurement. And then there's ratio. So these are things that are a subset of a larger thing, right? So income is what you get paid annually, is an annual rate of what you're getting paid, right? It's a ratio of income per year. And if we think about crime rates, which we'll talk about later in lecture 2, that's an annual rate of a per year per certain population. And these are examples from another textbook that I like. It's so the nominal measures, female or male, there's no, like if we assign 1 to female and 2 to male in our data analysis, there's no quantifiable difference. It's not a ranked order, right? And so an ordinal measure, as you can see, this is sort of a Likert scale on how important religion is to you. Not very important, fairly important, very important. And we don't really know if the difference between not very important and fairly important is the same as the difference between most important and very important, right? But we can sort of rank them. The interval measure of IQ, we do know that these differences are the same as this difference, right? It's quantifiable, and they're like, whereas this is a spectrum that's sort of gradiated, as you see here, people are at specific intervals. And then a ratio measure like I talked about. So if you get 10,000 a year, it is on a specific metric, but it is within a larger, it's a rate, right? It's what you get paid annually. Okay, so we can think of measurement as scoring, like how are we quantifying these individual attributes and putting them into categories, right? Like I talked about before, your book talks about there are variables and then there are specific attributes. So for each variable, we're assigning numbers to those specific attributes. And sometimes the numbers make sense because they mean something, and sometimes they're just categorical, right? And this can often be difficult in criminal justice research because we're talking about social structures, and crime rate in itself is sort of hard to measure too, which I'll talk about in a second as well. So there's different units of analysis. So like we talked about, if we're talking about gender, race, yearly income, we're talking about individuals. We're talking about specific people. And lots of times in criminology and criminal justice, we're measuring people. Other times we're measuring groups. So if we're measuring gangs, or we're measuring comparing crime rates of different cities or municipalities or states, that is groups that we're talking about. And we're trying to compare them by sort of identifying the same characteristics and making sure that they are comparable, right? And I'll talk about how we do that with crime rates in a second as well. And then organizations. So police departments will often look into, in criminal justice, drug treatment facilities, courtrooms. So oftentimes there's established leaders and roles, and there's also established goals. So this is sort of where you get more into program evaluation when you're using organizations as a unit of analysis. And then this is what your book was talking about that I think I called content analysis, which is actually social artifacts. And so this is the products of social beings and their behaviors. So it's sort of the secondary data that we look at. If you're into like social media analysis and like how people discuss or communicate on social media and you want to read tweets or whatnot, that would be a social artifact, right? And so now that we have conceptualized, we have identified numbers and measurements, this is moving us towards operationalization. So it's the process of developing definitions, and it moves us closer to ending our measurement process, and it requires us to determine what might work data collection-wise. So we want to quantify these things, but often we're dependent on how we're collecting data, and the process by which we collect our data is going to be framed by the measurements we're thinking about, and then sometimes we have data that we're already working with, so we're going to have to take that data and make sure it like matches the conceptions that we're trying to study. So variables should always be exhaustive and mutually exclusive. So you have to, like when we're thinking about like binary variables, whether or not it's a violent or non-violent crime, right? We can't have something in between that, because then that sort of undermines what we're trying to study. And these things have to be mutually exclusive too. So you can't have violent, non-violent crime that like is somehow attached to a violent crime. And we'll talk more about this, but it's definitely something that you want to make sure your variables are exhaustive and mutually exclusive, or else the validity of them is not going to be it's not going to be valid. And so reliability and validity, like I was sort of getting into, are two means in which we can measure, we can talk about the quality of measurement and variables. So whether a particular reliability is sort of like if we had a speedometer and we made sure that our car was going the same time each time, and the speedometer also had the same time each time, then that means it's a reliable form of measurement. Versus if we had a car that was going at different speeds, but our speedometer kept saying that it was the same speed, that's not a reliable measurement. It's unreliable. We don't know if it'll give us the same thing each time it sees that particular thing. But let's say our speedometer is off by 10 miles per hour, and we think people are going 10 miles per hour over what they're actually going because our speedometer is just not adjusted or calibrated the right way. Then we could be doing traffic stops on a lot of different people, but because we're not being accurate. But in that same situation, the quality of our measurement is reliable, it's just not accurate. And you might, something that a more practical, if you're thinking more of social sciences perspective of reliability, is like if you're going to courtrooms and you're observing race, right? My perspective of race might be different than someone else. And so race is often like, there's ethnicity and then there's race, and like how those things are defined vary greatly between countries and between cultures. So that is a variable that might have issues with reliability. Okay, so there are specific methods of dealing with reliability. So there's the test retest method. So what I was describing with the speedometer, if the car going the same distance and us calibrating and seeing the measuring the speed and seeing the same speed over and over again, then that's a form of test retest, right? Like we keep retesting and trying to see if the speedometer gets the miles per hour that we're actually going. And then there's inter-rater reliability. So if two people had speedometers and we're measuring it on the same car and we compared the measurements of those two people, that's inter-rater reliability. If you're observing race in a courtroom and there are two people who are determining what the race of a particular defendant is, then there's more inter-rater reliability, means that it's more reliable. And then there's the split half method. So you can use multiple measures for one concept and see if it measures it differently. So let's say we're looking at economic status and we're looking at yearly rate of income, and then we're also going to look at yearly rate of sort of expenses that people buy, like their gross spending. Those are sort of different aspects of the same coin. It's like how much you spend versus how much you take in, right? And another thing, the second characteristic that we use to describe measurement is validity. So it's whether or not something reflects what we're actually considering. So if I am wanting to talk about mental health issues and depression, but instead I'm measuring income, like that makes absolute no face validity whatsoever. Like depression is like psychological, and we should be looking at behaviors and patterns in that specific area if we want to look at it, not spending habits, right? So face validity, as I talked about, is if on face value, if something makes sense and looks like it would measure what we're talking about. So like the example in your book is that sentence length that a judge determines is likely reflective of the crime seriousness, right? We know that judges are more punitive for more severe crimes. And if that's the case, then it has face validity. But if the judge is not more punitive regarding more serious crimes, then it doesn't have face validity for us to look at sentencing. And there are limitations to this. So if we're doing an experiment or a study and it's very apparent what we're studying and it's very apparent to who's being studied, what's being studied, then there's more likelihood, there is the risk that the study participant can sort of adjust their own perspective to give the researchers what they want, right? And then there's content validity. It's like, if they're like, are we fully representative in what we're aiming to measure? If I'm wanting to measure, and this is a good example, so you guys have a quiz coming up next on these couple of chapters. So if I include only a portion of the content that we covered, then I'm not having content validity because it's not fully reflective of everything we've covered. If I only talk specifically about crime rate and not the means in which we measure specific things, like I'm talking about in the beginning part of lecture, I only focus on the content in the beginning part of lecture and the quizzes and not the end part of lecture, then there's the content validity of my measurement. The quiz is not reflective of the true representationalness of the lecture and of the content that I am hoping that you guys all learn, right? Yeah, so content validity is not tested for. It's not like I can have an alternate test that tests the quiz that I'm providing you. It's instead me assuring that I'm covering all of the specific content. And usually experts are the ones who define this. So content validity in the criminal justice system could look like risk assessment scores if they are only covering whether or not an individual is likely to fail to appear in court, and not whether or not an individual is likely to commit a crime, then it's not an accurate risk assessment. But if it includes both of them based off of studies that have been done previously, then and those two factors are what people have focused particularly on and say are important for risk assessment, then it does have content validity if it has the two aspects that researchers have said are important, right? And then there's construct validity. So this is more towards this conceptual idea that we have. Are the more operationalized measurements of what we're doing reflective of that? And it often has to do to when we'll get into causal analysis with how variables relate to each other too. So an example is depression, which I mentioned before. It's hard to conceptualize. It looks different from person to person. There are introverts who have depression and there are extroverts, so it might look different between those two types of people. But there are different indicators that psychologists have developed in behaviors and in energy levels that line up to define this construct based off of previous research, right? And then there's criterion validity, which we don't deal with too much in criminal justice, but we don't deal with too much in criminal justice, but for example, if you have some test outside of what your observations are that you can sort of validate your measurements with, that's helpful. So the example provided is if there's self-report observations on self-report data on whether or not people are using drugs, and if you actually drug test them, right? That's an alternative criteria that you can use to ensure that the measurement is valid. So this is a summary, and a way to get at measuring and ensuring validity is to use alternate measures or composite measures that include multiple forms of measurement to make sure that you're getting at the construct that you want to get at. And I think this visual is pretty helpful. So this is something like I described as reliable but not valid. These are the measurements we're taking. So this would be in the example of the car, let's say the car is moving at 65 miles per hour, but our speedometer keeps saying 75. So it's off towards what the actual measurement should be, but it's reliable. It keeps saying the same thing over and over again. This is something that's valid but not reliable. So we're getting close to the 65 miles per hour, we're getting 69, 64, and when we average these out, it's pretty valid, right? It'll get us to the center, but we need to take multiple measurements to get near that. and it's not reliable. So sometimes it's telling us one thing when it really is this specific thing. And then for something to be valid and reliable, we're getting closer and closer to the truth, right? It's some form of measurement that we're getting that is close to that 65 miles per hour. Maybe there's a little bit of error in it, but if we average them out, it is going to give us the truth. Whereas this may be a little biased towards, okay, if this is 65 miles per hour, then it's going to be telling us that this is 68. Whereas if we average this out, it'll be telling us that it's 65. And criminal justice. So when we're conceptualizing crime, what comes to mind? Oftentimes we're thinking of physical harm that has happened to people, or we're thinking of property that is being taken. And so we use specific words and symbols to communicate these meanings. And a lot of police departments and legislators have defined this for us, right? Like we're thinking of assault or burglary, and all these things have been conceptualized and developed into categories of what crime is. So if we go back to the measurement steps, oftentimes we're sort of dealing with measurements in the real world in criminology and working up to, and trying to connect that to our own conceptual definition of what we want to research. And oftentimes we have to use measurements in the real world because crime is measured and enforced by police and outside of academia, right? Whereas like in psychiatry or psychological studies, the discipline itself is what defines mental health issues, right? There's a diagnostic that defines, like the psychologists and the psychiatrists are the ones that are defining depression and anxiety and all of these sort of mental health issues, whereas we are sort of dealing with how society has defined crime. So who defines crime? So crime is defined by the government legislatively, and there's a lot of like states and cities have their own rights to define what crime is. So sometimes crime will be very different from state to state, between counties, and whatnot. Like, for example, whether or not pepper spray is illegal or guns, right? That varies in restrictions from state to state, and possession of a weapon, it being illegal is different in state to state, or usually state to state, not municipality to municipality, but like also we see that crime changes over time, right? Like at one point in the US we prohibited alcohol, and that changed, and now we're sort of on the flip side of that, where a lot of states are legalizing recreational marijuana. So how we see different drug use or behaviors as illegal changes over time. And so crime reflects our collective values and how we collectively define what is wrong. And criminologists are not usually telling the government how to define crime, right? We're working with the government's definitions of crime. And we also study like social deviance as well. So things that aren't necessarily criminal but might lead towards more criminal things. So Howard Becker's book Outsiders, he's a classic sociologist who took like a broader perspective of crime. He, for example, studied people who like play music on subways, right? It's, if you have a permit, it's not necessarily illegal, but it could be connected to more, it's sort of an alternative lifestyle, right? So we have sort of a different means of conceptualizing crime. So this is an image that I sort of drew for you. I'm sorry, my drawing is not I'm no artist. But if this is the official crime rate, which I'll talk about how we define it in a second, there are all these other sort of surveys and self-report data that we can use and use and operationalize into our constructs specifically of crime that we want to focus on. So we'll get into this in a second, but official crime rates are not ideal for if you're wanting to look at sexual assault and interpersonal violence, right? There is not a lot of reporting that goes on to police directly in those incidences, right? They're harder to capture because there are a bunch of disincentives to report and incentives not to report, and just like cultural stigma and whatnot that make measuring those things difficult. So victimization surveys have developed to address those in self-report surveys. And sort of these are official ways in which we have historically defined crime. And before we got into victimization surveys and self-report surveys, a lot of criminologists thought that crime was like completely pervasive for people who are of lower education and lower income. But when they did self-report surveys in like wealthier neighborhoods, they found that no, people were reporting similar rates of crime across, or not that there were similar rates of crime, but that there were crimes that were coming from wealthier neighborhoods, and that this sort of correlation was not as strong as they had thought in class and crime. And then there are crimes that we don't necessarily capture in official crime rates, like hate crimes and more institutional discrimination and whatnot. We haven't, you could develop measures. That's why it's sort of here. If you wanted to, you could bring this water level lower and define measures of crime based off of these things. You could conceptually. Let's see, I have a question. The question was, is it saying that self-report surveys and victimization surveys have false negatives and positives? So they definitely do. What I'm trying to say is that in victimization and official crime rates, there are false positives and false negatives in both of those things, and that's the error that we're getting. So sometimes in victimization surveys, people will report that they're victimized, but they're not, right? And that's an error that we get when we're sampling, when we're trying to observe things. And in official crime rates too, if a police officer picks someone up for something that they say that they did, but they didn't necessarily do something, that's a false positive. So we can see the false positive and false negatives in any of these forms of measurement. They look like individual error, an individual reporting of something that is not accurate. So, for example, false negatives in an official crime rate or a self-report survey or victimization survey would be someone who is surveyed by a victimization survey but doesn't necessarily show that they were victimized. Maybe they don't want to report it. So that's a false negative. And in a self-report survey, if someone is worried that when they fill out the form that the researchers are going to share the information with the police, they might not disclose that information. So that's a false negative. And in official crime rates, something that we have to deal with is that police often don't get to see everything that people are doing, and they're deployed in certain neighborhoods. So if crimes are happening in a house on private property, it's more difficult to measure that. So that would also be a false negative. And then, as I was sort of alluding to, there are crimes down here that are practically excluded because we can't measure them, like interpersonal violence. There's stigma around sexual assault and reporting, and you see this with the Me Too movement. A lot of people are publicly disclosing that they were being assaulted rather than going to the police because there's just a really low clearance rate, which is there's a really low probability that those crimes are going to be solved and taken to court and actually prosecuted, right? And then there's also self-help, is this idea that sometimes in certain neighborhoods or in certain spaces, it just makes more sense for you to deal with things within your own community, right? So you might not call the police because you just want to deal with it on your own and maybe have some other measurement of punishment that you define with your community, or you just handle the situation with yourself, right? Like gangs do this a lot, right? There's a conflict within it, they'll deal with it within themselves rather than going to the police. And then sometimes too, like police involved crimes don't get reported because of corruption and whatnot. And we see that as well. And so these are things that are practically excluded from these official crime rates. And it's harder to get this level of water down here because we practically can't get these things because it would be intrusive or obtrusive, and we can't be everywhere at one time to observe all crime, right? Okay. So, what we developed to sort of address this are composite measures. And the crime rate is a composite measure. I will define it further in a second. It's a composite measure is when we have indicators that we collectivize together and scale, right? Sometimes they are have different measurements and scale and are weighted, and sometimes they are not. But it allows us to combine multiple measures into one, so we have a composite. And our crime rate is a composite measure, how crime rates are developed in general. So crime rates are the number of index crimes based on UCR data, and we'll get into what UCR data are in a second. But there are a list of specific crimes that we define divided by the population of the space they're being collected. So if I'm taking Trenton, for example, my city where I live, if I take all of the crimes from the UCR database of index crimes and total them, and then divide them by the population of Trenton and times them by 100,000, then that's a crime rate that's comparable to Newark. And so then I'm comparing cities and their specific crime rates. And the population, and dividing it by the population and timesing it by 100,000 makes me able to compare a small city to a large city because I'm creating it as a rate, a ratio, rather than just the total number of crimes. Because if I were to do just the total number of crimes and compare Trenton to New York City, the population affects the number of crimes that are able to happen, because the more people there are, the more likelihood there are crimes. More opportunities for crimes, more people who are able to commit crimes. So that's why we turn it into a ratio, is so that we can compare units in an appropriate way that takes into account population. And so crime rates are inherently spatial, right? We're usually talking about a jurisdiction, a state, a city, a town, a county, and they reflect police deployment and record keeping, which I'll get into. in a second. And there are sometimes political incentives for suppressing crime rates or reporting them as lower. Say there's a police chief and his goal is to really show that he's reduced crime in a particular city, and his job is sort of dependent on that. Then there might be pressure to sort of report that crime is being reduced, even if it isn't. And then there's also a sense of reporting is built like very dependent on police and community trust. So if people are not trustful to call the police in the first place, then your crime rate might be underreported because people don't want to call the police to deal with their crime. And something that we haven't really dealt with in criminal justice, but I think is important to think about, is we don't really know how private police forces play into crime rates. So sometimes they collaborate with larger jurisdictions to help define what crime is, and to report crime to police. And then sometimes private police will sort of deal with things on their own. Like maybe they can write someone up for something, but because it's like a police force that's in a gated community or something, they deal with it on their own. And it's sort of hard to determine how exactly private police play into that. And the index of crimes that we have here don't include like white collar crimes. And because the crime rate is spatial and we're usually talking about jurisdictions, often white collar crimes are done over the internet, or like corporations are national and have like multiple nations in which they function in. So really defining where a crime committed in white collar crime is a little bit more difficult. So oftentimes when we're looking at official crime reports, we are thinking about very specific crimes and not the full totality of all crimes that could occur. So here's a question for you guys. What unit of analysis is the crime rate? We talked about different units of analysis of an individual, groups, organizations, social artifacts. So what unit of analysis are crime rates? We can sometimes measure it as individuals. Yes, so it's groups. Your answer is sort of reflective of what we're doing, because what we're taking is the crime rate as a composite score, right? So we're taking individual incidences of crimes that have been reported and adding them all up, like we said over here. So number of specific crimes, these are individuals right here. But when we add all these individuals up, it's an aggregate. And because we're dividing it by the population of a certain jurisdiction or municipality and turning it into a rate, then it turns into a unit of analysis by group. But the input here, the number of crimes, are individual incidences, right? So it is groups. It's usually cities or counties or states that we're talking about in our unit of analysis when we're talking about crime rates. And so, like we had talked about, crime rates are dependent on crimes known to police. And this is a measure that we often depend on in criminal justice, but has its issues because, like we said, not all crimes are reported to police. And your book talks about how assaults and robberies are not well measured by police. Sometimes people don't report those, or robberies are hard to report as well. And so most crimes that occur where police are involved, there's a victim or witnesses. And sometimes the bystander effect, I don't know if you've heard of that, where like there are multiple witnesses and no one reports something until like it's sort of too late. That has an issue with crimes known to police. And there are some crimes that are like exclusively only police can measure, like traffic or victimless offenses. And so it's all dependent on where we deploy police, because police are more likely to find crimes with in neighborhoods where there are high deployment, because there are more police officers on the street to see those crimes, right? And so it's sort of a tricky scenario, because it's sort of reflective of the administration, and it's not like an independent party, right? Like, police officers sort of define crime, enforce crime, and they're also measuring crime. And there's issues with sometimes more professionalized police departments will have higher rates of crime, but it's not necessarily because that space has more crime. It's because they have more police officers out on the street that can report the crime, right? So it's a tricky situation in defining crime and measuring it by crimes known to police. And so the three databases that you'll be familiar with as criminal justice majors are the Uniform Crime Reports, which is the UCR, and this is like the longest standing, most consistent measurement we've had of crime. But it's neither exclusive or exhaustive. So it doesn't, because of the hierarchy rule, how many of you have heard of the hierarchy rule or know what it is in the UCR? If you can type it in, that'd be great. But the hierarchy rule, I'll just sort of tell you, is a rule in the UCR where if there's multiple crimes that happened in a specific, yes, so they use the most serious crime if there are multiple crimes that happened in a specific place and time. So let's say there was a person who robbed a store and then went to, fled the scene and then like murdered someone, murdered like someone that they had kidnapped while they did that. The crime that would be logged would be murder, right? The other two, robbery and fleeing the scene of a crime, would not be logged. So it's not exhaustive because it doesn't include all of the crimes in a particular incident, and it's not exclusive either. And so these are aggregate level indexes in the form of crime rates that we can talk about counties or municipal jurisdictions and our characteristics of them that we can define. But say you just want to be looking at like homicide, there's also the supplementary homicide reports, which the FBI gets, and all of these are mediated by the FBI that collects all of these reports from law enforcement, and law enforcement are the ones that are reporting and defining these and submitting these yearly, quarterly to the larger federal government, and the federal government sort of aggregates all of this for us. And there's been this shift to the National Incident-Based Reporting System, which doesn't have the hierarchy rule, is incident-based rather than I guess how to describe the UCR. If the National Incident-Based Reporting System is incident-based, then the UCR is sort of situation-based, and there are multiple incidents that can happen in a situation. And so NIBRS is sort of more effective because it can get at multiple incidents within one situation. And there are, in order for police departments to report to the NIBRS, they need to have done like a training and have some certain quality of control and be certified to do that. So it is mutually exclusive as well. And so the two offenses, there's part 1 offenses in the UCR and there are part 2. And when we look at our crime rate, we're just talking about these specific offenses. So if you're reading a crime rate in a journal, article, or news report, it's talking specifically about murder, manslaughter, rape, robbery, assault. And these other crimes are not often included in those crime rates. So some problem that comes up is that sometimes police focus on these specific crimes because it will reduce the crime rate for that specific precinct or area or whatnot. And sometimes they use different measures because maybe they do want to focus on these specific crimes as well. So, like I had mentioned, before, in a lot of research on criminal justice and criminology, we've just taken what police reported data we have had, and there was a push to address this dark figure of crime, these more interpersonal crimes, or crimes with no victims or no one reported. Like, how do we capture those? So researchers developed surveys, victimization surveys, to ask people if they've ever been victimized by an individual, or if anything, a crime has ever occurred to them. And then there are self-report surveys, so for people to anonymously disclose whether or not they have done crimes themselves. And so there are 4 different types of these surveys, and we can divide them into victimization surveys and self-report surveys. There's the National Crime Victimization Survey, so if you're more interested in crimes that are less likely to be reported by police, this is a good source of data for you to look into. And it's a longitudinal study, which means that they have specific households that agree to participate, and then they sort of measure over time if that household has been victimized at another point in time. And then there's also community victimization surveys, and they're instituted by the Census Bureau and by sort of individual police jurisdictions that help develop those statistics with the Bureau of Justice. And then we also have these self-report surveys. So they deal with drug use and health, because those are often underreported, and like there's a different means of capturing that. And there's the Monitoring the Future survey, which looks at particularly high school students. So people focused on juvenile delinquency might look at the Monitoring the Future report to look at drug crimes that aren't necessarily captured by official reporting. And then there are also drug surveillance systems that can provide us with what specific drug crimes and drug usage might look like. But obviously this is, the sample is within particular people who have already been within the drug use system. So it sort of is more descriptive of how drug use occurs rather than being able to measure drug use on a national level, right? Because it's not a national sample. Okay, so sort of what sources to look at based off of what crimes you're interested in. So if you are interested in murder and crimes in which victims is a business or commercial establishment, then the UCR and SHR are good indicators. And then there's also, like, you can look into, UCR has property crimes versus violent crimes that you can also look into if you are wanting to distinguish between those as well. And then there's crimes against persons or households that aren't reported to the police, like we talked about, are good sources, the NCVS, and then self-report surveys often don't have identifiable victims and are less often reported to police. So we can sort of use these official sources of data to define what types of crime we want to look at. So when we're trying to analyze crime, we might ask ourselves, like, what offenses are we interested in? Are we interested in nonviolent crime, violent crime? Are we interested in interpersonal violence, victimless offenses? What unit analysis are we looking at? Are we looking at jurisdictions? Are we looking at individuals and who they are and what types of crime they commit? Are we looking at victims and like what victims look like and descriptively? And then what purpose are we using this for? So for police officers, it's to like sort of log enforcement and deployment. If we're trying, which is monitoring in some ways, if we're trying, they're also trying to develop some sort of accountability for themselves as well. And then if oftentimes research, we're trying to measure different things necessarily than police known crimes are focused on as well. So we can sort of use these sources of data to define the crimes that we specifically want to look at. And so like we can take this line and sort of scoot it down. If we want to focus on white collar crime, we can develop our own index for that and include it into a crime rate that we develop ourselves, right? So we could do like a white collar crime rate or a hate crime rate for a jurisdiction and sort of develop that ourselves. Okay. And then there are sort of dimensions and aspects of concepts that we can further subdivide. So there's, like we were sort of talking about, we can define the dimensions of crime that we're interested in: violent, non-violent, delinquency, victimless crimes. And then there's indicators, if there was property damage, whether or not there was reporting, survey metrics. And these lead us to a deeper understanding of what we're trying to look at specifically. So oftentimes crime, we're trying to understand what causes crime. And so sometimes we're looking at socioeconomic status and how that might cause crime and how that's related to crime. So in this picture, what is the independent variable? If you could type that in. Yes, exactly. Thank you. The independent variable is socioeconomic status, and we're seeing how that affects the dependent variable crime. And sometimes we'll see like how crime affects people's perceptions or whatnot. So sometimes crime can be the independent variable, but if we're looking at it from this diagram, from this perspective, crime is the dependent variable. And I'm just showing this slide so we can reaffirm what the independent versus the dependent variable is. And we have the independent variable that affects the dependent variable. So if we're thinking about socioeconomic status, there's a conceptual definition. So there's a social standing or class of an individual or group. That's the conceptual definition that we think of when we think of socioeconomic status. And so we try to develop a working definition to sort of take this definition and make it more tangible, because social standing could mean a lot of things to a lot of different people, right? And class can mean different things in different contexts and cultures. So we try translating that into an operational definition. And so how we do that is we develop a composite measure of education, income, type of occupation, and place of residence, right? Because place of residence has an influence on how expensive things are in your neighborhood, right? And so this spells out precisely what this means. We have these different indicators: education, income, occupation, that we're putting into a composite measure to define this. So it's the content of it is exhaustive and exclusive, and it spells out exactly what we need. So the way the NCVS, which is the victimization survey, measures has 3 different indexes for socioeconomic status. So there's an education index, there's an income, employment, and housing. And as you see, these different indexes are slightly different. So housing is not included in Index 3, and housing is measured differently in Index 1 and 2. So whether or not an individual rented or owned the place of residence is an indicator for housing versus whether or not the person is in public housing or non-public housing is another indicator. So when we're trying to have these more abstract concepts, we need to develop them into specific measures, and these are the attributes of these specific variables that we're defining. And so when we're doing a composite measure, there's a number in each of these sub-variables that an individual household or individual can have, and when we add these all up, there's a range by which they have high SES or low. So the numbers that are higher are associated with higher economic standing, and the numbers that are lower are associated with lower economic standing. So when we add these all up, they develop into a range of 0 to 8, right? And these aren't weighted. So in some indexes, you might weight income higher than you would education because it's more correlated with economic standing. But in this specific one, they're not weighted, they're just additive. And that's the same, it's sort of a similar process when we look at the official crime rate, is we're adding up all of these incidences in a given area and they're not weighted. So murder is not considered higher than arson necessarily, and that can be an issue with official crime rates, is that these things aren't weighted. It's just an additive index of all of these things. So that's something you can adjust based off of your own research research goals. But back to this example of socioeconomic status, these again are all additive. And so if we look at SES and how it is associated with crime rate, we have crime rate here on the left, and then where people stand in SES. So this is 0 to 1. And so because these things are aggregates, sometimes we will get averages that are not necessarily, when we aggregate this based off on an individual level, we might get an average, let's say they average to a number that isn't a whole number. So as you see here, the index for option 2 is slightly different, but these indexes show that as there is an increase in SES, there is a decrease in crime for that specific area. We're still talking about areas here in municipalities and jurisdictions, but SES helps us measure how the social structure and economic structure might influence crime. And so we might have slightly different outcomes depending on the composite that we develop. But as long as it has base validity, has construct validity, this should all level out. And so we can see this too with disorder. So one theory is social disorganization. So how do we measure disorder and social disorder, right? So we can have different measures of sort of indicators that can add up to a composite and an index. So we can count the number of abandoned buildings in a certain neighborhood, the garbage and litter, graffiti, and then these social disorders, and then divide it by the population and times it by a rate like we do with crime rate, 100,000, and then we can compare neighborhoods and their levels of disorder by developing a composite. Then there's also typologies, which we develop. So, for example, let's say that we're trying to measure things, and there's more categorical analysis that we want to do. So if we want to do types of delinquent acts, there might be a different sort of range in which we have none, moderate, or serious. And this isn't a composite score, but it's something that we categorically label. So instead of adding up all the theft and gangs and carrying weapons into a composite score, instead, if any of these things are present, then we're going to label it as moderate. If any of these things are present, then we're going to label it as none or minor. And so this is similar to a composite score, but it's different because we're categorizing things, and instead of creating a numerical aspect to it that represents a range, it's instead we're taking different indicators and labeling them as categories. And we can do this too. Another example is sort of what type of delinquent acts at a second time. So let's say we're starting with these delinquent acts. Maybe people are non-delinquent, or they're starting, or they're desisting, which means they're not doing crime anymore. They're stopping doing crime. We can label and categorize certain variables with these attributes. So these are still all attributes. It's just how we are defining the attributes that are different. So this is categorical versus this previous one. These previous ones are composite. We're defining them within a range. And we're going to talk more about validity and sampling and how we develop and create these variables based off of a specific sample. But this lecture was just about measurement and variables and attributes. And the way usually we define these things is by getting a smaller sample of the population and categorizing variables and developing what the attributes for those variables are. Sometimes we depend on secondary data, like we talked about with the NCVS, the victimization survey. Sometimes we're collecting the data ourselves, and so we need to think about sampling as well. But measurement, we can do measurement with these secondary sources of data without sampling, and we can sort of see how crime rate applies to that. But if we're wanting to collect our own data, we need to think about sampling and how things have happened. And we'll also talk about how these specific secondary data sources, how they sample things, right? And so victimization surveys want to get a national image of everything that's going on. And the Monitoring the Future report just samples youth. So we can say things about youth using the Monitoring the Future report, but we can't necessarily say things about the adult population and drug use, right? So we're going to get more into sampling in our next lecture, but this was more about how we conceptualize measurements and variables and how we specifically measure things. And I'm going to just end it on where we are in the measurement of things, which was my first slide. So we finished this aspect, but it often informs population and sampling. So Thursday, we're also going to talk about population and sampling, like I said, and we'll reiterate some of the concepts and themes that we talked about here. And then after next week, we're going to get into specific types of research methods. So whenever any research project that you're working on, you're always going to have to deal with conceptualization and operationalization. Sometimes you'll be using secondary data, so you'll learn about how they sampled the population, and sometimes you'll have to sample it yourself. But these two, the population sampling and the conceptualization and operationalizations, are really important foundations for when you get into these specific research methods. So we have to have a good understanding of this process and this process in order to understand what types of tools we can use. Okay, I am done unless you guys have any other questions.